Welcome back. Well, it's been nearly 7 years since I produced a couple of videos detailing the setup and operation of this fine Lee Loadmaster progressive reloading press. And in that time, I've improved my lighting, I've improved my sound quality. I'm actually producing on a much different camera than I had back then. Back then, I was actually using a tape camcorder, and I had to digitize it. It was quite a process. So I've got better sound. Everything should be better. I've even got a different shirt on since then. But Lee has recognized that there were some operational issues, some problems that people were having with priming and sometimes with powder dispensing, and they've incorporated some changes, some very worthwhile changes to their machine since then. There's only one minor change that I know of that they've made to the press frame itself, and all the other changes are something that anybody from any generation of press ownership can take advantage of. I'll take you through what the changes were to that frame itself and to all the different parts. Some of the parts have been modified since then, and I think everything has been for the better. I found this to be an exceptionally, robust machine. I've been operating this particular machine now for almost 15 years, nonstop, and it's never given me any significant issues. I had some problems initially with primer feeding and primer seating, and Lee has been so good about sending me the necessary parts to upgrade that, and at that time it was at no charge to me. Now, the last time I received any upgrade to the priming system was back about at least 8 years ago. So in that time, I think they've made a couple of different modifications that, different parts changes that have improved things even further. I haven't required them for my particular press. Everything is running smoothly, but I'll do what I can to show you what the design changes have been in those years, so that no matter what generation machine you have, you'll certainly be able to follow along. So let's step over the bench and get right into this. Now, when you open your box up brand new, you're not going to find all these parts. I'm going to go over some of the different die options that you can take advantage of, and show you what each of these parts perform. I understand that people sometimes have problems with Lee instruction manuals. They're somewhat sparse. They do a good job, I think, explaining how to install things, but probably a little bit short on the why and what these parts accomplish. And sometimes not knowing what a part is accomplishing means that you really, you're lacking the information that you need to install things correctly. So and to adjust things correctly. So I'll bring you through each of those parts and explain them in great detail. Now, if you have an older machine that dates back to this vintage right here, you're going to have one of these oil fittings, and that oil fitting will accommodate one of these cans right here. It's an old Eagle pump oiler, and with the ball bearing fitting at the end, you squeeze in, doing it with one hand here, but you simply position that fitting with the ball bearing attachment and squeeze in motor oil. Only motor oil. In other words, any grade motor oil will be fine. It doesn't make any difference what viscosity is, but squeeze it in until you lubricate this ram right here. The ram itself will collect oil as you move it up and down, and you'll see an oil ring build up at the base of the frame here. Now, in more recently made machines, they've omitted that oil fitting, and I think that's a good idea, because it's difficult to find one of these cans, for one thing, and it meant having to buy something extra. Whereas instead of using this can, if you have the older machine, that's fine, but instead of using that can, They now recommend instead using STP motor oil treatment as a lubricant on this ram. Just simply take your finger and wipe around all sides 360 degrees and work the press up and down, and that will lubricate that for the operation of the machine throughout one loading session. It should be, they recommend reapplying oil at the beginning of each loading session. There are 3 Zerk fittings at the linkage of this press that must be greased about every 1,000 rounds. And it comes factory greased, so it doesn't need any more, but just standard axle grease. And I certainly recommend that you use a good grade of grease. Don't buy the cheapest stuff, because what happens is some of the cheap greases, the oil and the stiffener will separate, and then it actually starts running out. So, you know, buy a standard type of grease that you can get in one of these. You don't need to get a big grease gun. You know, this is a very inexpensive grease gun that you can get at Napa or any Walmart or any place. And I like to use a marine grade grease just simply because it costs about the same, and I can use it on my boat too, on my engine. So that's what that is. So again, just about every 1,000 rounds or so is sufficient to grease that. And whatever you do, as you're applying your fitting here, push too hard and you'll actually push that out the other side. This is just a friction fitting on this lowest section. But if you need to push it back out, you just the other side, just give it a slight tap with a ball peen hammer, and it'll come. You can center it. On the base of this ram, way down at the bottom, you'll find that there's a plate with a dog leg on the side of it. If you push it in this direction, if you slide it in this direction, you will open up the gate that will dump all your spent primers. This ram will hold an amazing number of primers. I don't know, it holds well over 1,000 primers before it needs to be dumped. I like to dump it before I can start seeing them gather up above, because that's, you know, primer dust the old spent primer dust will get underneath your shell plate holder, and that's not a good thing. So make provisions. If you have a wide support like I do, you might have to modify your bench. I had to cut a slot out so I could open that gate. You can see how I can slide that open and close, and that opens up a very generous gateway. This is your primer seating ram, and that simply pushes the primers up from this position here, and the depth is controlled by this 1/4 bolt. Backing this bolt out, in other words downward, increases the primer seating depth, and raising it up lessens the primer seating depth. Make all changes in small increments, because this is a coarse 1/4 thread. So small turning changes with a 7/16 wrench. First of all, just loosen up the lock nut at the top with a 7/16 inch wrench, and then make your adjustments in small increments down here until you've got the correct seating. You don't want to be crushing your primers, and you certainly don't want to have them seated too shallow so that they basically they end up being cushioned, especially with striker-fired handguns that don't have a very hard firing pin fall. You can have some misfires because the primers are cushioned on the way down. So this thumb nut right here holds your die holder in place, and if you notice on certain sections of the die holder there are large notches. Those notches will align with that thumb screw, and do not use any anytime you see a thumb screw like this, never use any pliers, anything to mechanically turn that. All you need to do is position that slot right where that comes out on the other side, and turn it in just finger tight. That's all you need to do. And it turns in This is somewhat like an interrupted thread. Those notches will simply drop down in very easily and then engage themselves where it's appropriate. This is your shell feeder tongue. As cases are dropped onto this tongue from your loading tubes, atop which you have you may have a case collator. This will basically shake your cases down into those tubes handily without having to manually feed them. That is, the shell is then fed into place, slid into place by this device here, which is called basically a slider. And the slider just runs back and forth on this tongue, and we'll show you how that's set up. But in the most recent change to this slider system is that it's now a piggyback. In other words, without having to remove the bottom portion from the tongue, which was somewhat of a nuisance. You had to dismantle things without having to remove the bottom portion from the tongue to go from a small size, this is the older design, going from the small size slider to the larger size slider. Instead now you have one slider that is a piggyback design, and you can use taller cases such as 45 Long Colt, 38 Special, 357, 44 Magnum, 44 Special, 223s also. Because this is taller than the original tall design, significantly taller. It's about, I would say that's nearly 3/8 of an inch. It's a good 1/4 of an inch. That will now support a 223 case coming down from the tube. Now, I haven't actually checked that out myself. My understanding is that it will support it coming down from the tubes, whereas before you had to manually feed cases one at a time, otherwise it'd tip from the tube. Just one little note. In my previous video, I said never lube this tongue. In actuality, this small little square right here is a place where you can put a very tiny, and Lee specifies a very, very tiny amount of lubrication in that shallow square. I recommend that you use Lubriplate number 130 AA. Now, this is a different type of lubrication than standard axle grease. Axle grease is sticky. It really loves to attract dirt and make things a mess as you're operating your press, and it gets gummed up into anything it can find. This Lubriplate is a totally different thing. This is a calcium grease. Just put a tiny, tiny drop in that little square. No more than a tiny amount. Your slider will pick that up, and it shouldn't overflow the square hole there. So that's all you need to do. Is you can see how small an amount that is. I can zoom in here. I've got just enough to fill up that square hole, and no more than that. That's going to be enough to grease it. I wouldn't use any other kind of grease in there because it's very, very sticky, and you'll make a mess of things. Now, this pointed post right here that projects downward operates the primer feed. That pushes the primer feeder inward toward the ram. And if you'll notice that primer feeder jumps twice, that's because it encounters these two projections on the side of the frame right here. That shakes your tray and keeps your primers flowing down through that system. Now, you'll have if you have a newer press, you won't have a primer feed tray that looks like this one right here. This is the older style primer feed tray, and it works fine. They have an easier to load one now that is, basically it's square so that it fits the primer box that you invert, and then it folds in two into a triangle, and that fits into a similar situation. I haven't used one of those. I have no desire to change over. I've had no problems with this particular system, and until I have a problem, I'll keep what I have. But it's a somewhat modified design, but you can see how slick that is. If you have a older press and you're having priming issues, contact Lee. They've been very, very good to me. The last time I had to get a different primer feeding mechanism was well over 7 years ago, and they were very, very good and supplied me with the replacements for both the small primer feed mechanism and for the large primer feed mechanism. They're different size for the different size primers naturally. So, but if you have a new generation machine, I understand that the colors are different. They're color coded differently, and that's how they can tell what generation you've got. So if you call them on the phone, if you're having problems, they're going to ask you what color is your primer feed mechanism. Now these devices right here are your shell retainers. These position your shells correctly within the shell plate. And think of the shell plate basically as a multi-station version of a shell holder that you have on a single station press. But this retainer will hold those cases snugly inside those stations where they belong. It's important to note that there's a spring washer that must be positioned underneath the screw head, and that must be cup side down. In other words, the convex side should be upward, and we'll screw it into position here. But these should be snugged down, not overly tight, but just snugged down, and that way they'll be able to glide over the cases as they're positioned. The ball handle sometimes has a tendency to come loose. Don't be hammering it into place because you're likely going to split it and ruin it. Instead, just simply apply a little bit of silicone glue inside and put it back on, and that'll never come off. This waffle design on the side of your frame is not just there for strength, but it is a functional part of your shell plate indexer. This part right here, which I'll describe in detail as we go along, that's what actually moves your indexer in and out at the appropriate time. This device right here is your holder and positioner that retains your shell feed mechanism, and we'll show you how that's installed and adjusted correctly. Now you've got some different options when it comes to powder dispensing. I believe that the drum measure is now included with the machine from the factory. It's a very, very good system, I believe. It's very precise, and it can be adjusted with great ease. I'm personally a great fan of the disc system, and the disc system, the reason for that is because as I change from one caliber to another, I can simply use whichever disc I know is the correct disc or combination of two discs in order to give me exactly the right volume of powder that I need. It may not be as precise and exact as this drum measure, but when extreme precision is required, I've always just turned to this system here, and this replaces the disc and can be changed as you see with a thumb screw. It won't dispense large quantities of powder as a double disc will or this drum measure will, but it's a good option if you have to dispense a particularly fine adjustment. If you get the disc system, I heartily recommend that you get this attachment right here. This allows you to screw the device onto your press without having to actually turn this around physically in case you have a little bit of room. And that's not an expensive option, but it's very, very handy. And also, if you're using that system there, you'll need to use the bead chain that you may have to purchase separately. I don't know if it comes with the machine anymore. It used to come with the machine when you got the Lee Perfect powder dispenser, which I didn't find perfect at all. It tended to leak powder terribly. But this chain is required, and I believe it's probably sold as a set. It has a heavy spring here, and that's not actually to be used as a spring, but it's actually used as ballast to hold that chain downward and add some weight to it. And you have a bell adjuster right here, and you put that at the bottom of the chain, again leaving a good 1.5 inches for ballast. So that you may need to purchase separately if you decide to use the disc system. Cleanliness is absolutely key to proper operation of this and any machine like it. You must make sure that this head is kept meticulously clean and free of, you don't want to have oils and greases get in here to excess, because you're definitely going to be collecting a primer residue, and that's going to gum up your machine. And also occasionally powder will accidentally drop in there, and that will collect. So keep this clean using mineral spirits, and then finish it off with some alcohol, dry it off. And it's a good thing to have an air hose available that you can occasionally blow that out. Pay particular attention to where the priming mechanism is in this the semicircular hole here. That has to be kept very, very free of any debris and any greases. I'll show you what we do need to grease on this in a second. Be sure to clean your shell plate up completely every now and then, and get any powder debris or primer debris out from inside of those case slots. Anything in there that will keep those cases from going in fully will really bog the system down. Use some grease with a Q-tip to lightly grease the inside where it spins around, just lightly, no more than that. I'm using the Lubriplate here. I find that works really nicely, and it doesn't attract crud as much as the other types of greases do. On the underside of the plate, also just a light amount of lubrication. If you need more, you can add more, but start out with the least amount that you can get away with, because the more is not better here. This is an area where things can really bog down if you have grease collecting dirt. And older plates will have 5 nubs. This is a newer design on my 44 Magnum and 44 Special holder, but you'll find that they work both. As far as I can see, they work equally well. This is an improvement which I think perhaps is a little bit smoother. Okay, just drop your shell plate onto the head, and it should spin very freely. Now at this time, install your ejector. Your ejector goes in with the hook facing you, and position it squarely down onto that recess. And with your O-ring first, downward, and you'll see the recess on the nut here. Put that recess downward with the O-ring, screw it down all the way tightly, finger tight, and then just release the tension on it, just so that that indexer, that shell plate can turn freely without binding. Apply some grease on all 4 sides of this indexer, and take care to apply it on all sides, but not too heavily. You can always apply more if it's not running smoothly. Just all the way on all sides, and also at the very end. Apply some grease now to the inside of those fins, just a little bit on that indexer right there. And you don't want to have too much. Also apply some to this frame right here. And that will keep that in good slick operation. Also to this protrusion right here. So just those surfaces right there. You don't want to grease that one. That's not necessary. Just the raised surfaces. Raise your ram about 2/3 of the way up and locate the square hole that's right directly underneath this shell chute here, and insert the indexer with the small fin downward and the larger one upward. And also you'll notice there's a bright bevel. The bright bevel should be on the outside, in other words facing away from the machine. That bright bevel is very easy to see, but you don't want to have it on any other side. Just slide that into the square hole, turn your shell holder so that it meets up with it, and check its operation. That's binding a little bit right there, so check and see why. I possibly need to add a little bit more grease. We'll try it one more time. Sometimes it needs to seat itself. There we go. We're fine now. And snug this nut down a little bit more and see if it still operates. You want to keep that tight. Right now it's running very smoothly. So I can tighten that nut down finger tight now. Don't use ever any mechanical devices to tighten that. Never use any pliers. I run that a few times and it's running just as smooth as can be. So the grease has applied itself where it needs to, and we're running. Now back your thumb screw out and drop your die holder down in place, and take note of where those indexing spots are right there, and position it so that it will be in line with that thumb screw, and tighten the thumb screw into that recess. If that's done properly, you should look down through the top and see with the shell plate in position, they should be concentric. The shell plate should be positioned so that it's lining up with these holes. Now I know that in the owner's manual it suggests setting up your case feeding system before you set up the machine. I personally find it a little bit easier to do the other way around. So you can follow along with me, or you can backtrack and put the shell holder in first, whatever you find is most suitable for you. Now, you got a decision to make. Right now, from what I understand, the machines are shipping with an indexer, a case positioner, which is basically a case trimming die. The case trimming die is positioned over the priming station. In other words, that would be station number 2. And I'll describe the stations as we move along. But that makes sure that your case, basically it does not trim anything. It positions the case perfectly centered over the priming station so that you don't have primers catching the edge and flipping over. So you might have this system, which is a case trimming die, and if it's especially with the 223, it will come with this adjusting ring, this ring here, so that you can position it wherever you wish, up and down, wherever it's suitable. But this was a very, very good addition to the system. By placing this over the priming station, the station number 2, you no longer have a vacated hole there where cases could get out of alignment and have misfed primers. So this will be positioned with a 223 system. This would definitely should be positioned over the station number 2, over your priming system. With regard to handgun cases, you can do as I did before in my previous video, which is to install a universal decapping die. This will decap anything from .458 Winchester Magnum down to the smallest pistol cases. This is just a universal decapping die. All it does is it pops primers up. So in my earlier video, I suggested placing this in station number 1 to decap. That's the only station that you can decap cases, deprime cases. So I suggested placing this in station number 1, then removing the decapping pin from the resizing die and placing the resizing die over your priming station as station number 2. That still remains a good alternative. This die here, the resizing die, will perfectly position your case over the priming station and never have an issue. But the alternative method is to use the shell trimming die, which is placed over station number 2, and use a fully put together. This is your regular resizing die with the decapping pin installed. So I just want to review the setup of a standard sizing die with its decapping pin. Make sure that this decapping pin is flush with the top of this lock nut right here. This is a split nut which tightens down with a tapered thread and holds that pin in position. That should be flush. Now here's a very handy hint. What's that, Benny? You wait a minute now. A very handy thing to do if you have a machinist vise, which you should have. Is that right? Hang on a second now. Chuck this into your machinist vise, the smaller nut, rather than trying to grab hold of that with a wrench. Chuck this into the vise and then use the 3/4 inch wrench to turn the die. You'll have much more leverage and you can really get things snugged down tight. That should be very tight. Now you'll notice that we have not yet installed the priming system, and that's going to get in the way for the time being, so we'll do that later. Into station number 1, which is the station positioned directly over that shell tongue plate. Drop your handle all the way down and hold the handle downward. Screw the die down all the way until it meets the shell holder. Now if you haven't already done so, on each of your dies, turn the lock nut all the way to the top of your threads so that you can screw those down firmly. Once you're down firmly, finger tight onto that shell holder, release the ram and screw it down 1/4 of a turn more, and then reapply pressure to your ram and tighten down the lock nut. Only finger tight. Never use any wrenches on that to tighten it any farther than that, because you're going to damage that lock ring. That lock ring has got a recess underneath it with a nice O-ring, and it requires nothing more than finger snugness in order to hold that forever. It will not come loose. Now again, I'm using the case trimmer die option in station number 2. So that, again, with the lock nut all the way to the top. I can screw this now. I don't have to, this is not a die that requires any fine adjusting, so I can just simply screw it down fully. This die only positions the cases, and it basically holds your shell holder in exact alignment with all your stations, especially the priming station. That's the one that's so critical, because you have just got one small hole the size of your primer, and the primer has to be in perfect alignment. So that's why it's important to have a die at this station number 2. So I've got that tightened down. There's no interference with the shell holder whatsoever. Things are still running smoothly. Now we move to station number 3. Now for station number 3, you're going to need a case of the correct caliber that you're loading for. Make sure you keep your primer in. Don't use a decapped case, because you're going to be pouring powder into this and measuring it. You'll also need a bullet of that caliber. Open up your case retainer in station number 3 and insert a case into that position and run that all the way up so that your handle is fully down. Your third station die should be set up thusly. This is a two-part die, actually. This is a combination. I've used a riser. The riser, I find, is an important accessory that if you don't have, you probably should order one. This allows your powder measure to be up above the other dies, so it's not in the way and causing problems getting at things. And in your powder charging die is also, with a pistol case, this is also the die that bells the mouth of the case. In other words, opens up the case mouth so that it will accept a bullet. This is the smaller diameter, and that will affect that change as it goes deeper into the case. On the outside of this larger diameter, I suggest putting a very, very light amount of lubriplate, very, very slight. You don't want to have any grease that will migrate into this hole here and capture powder. That's a horror show. You're going to have powder collecting there and bridging and giving you inaccurate loads and sometimes overloads when it dumps. And you certainly don't want to have any powder migrating down onto this section here either, because that's just going to gum things up. So you notice you can't even see the grease. It's just what I put on with my finger that prevents corrosion and allows that to operate nice and smoothly. So that goes down inside your case expansion die, combination expansion die, and powder charging die, along with the riser. And make sure that you have your O-ring in position and just snug them together by hand, just finger tight, with the ram fully up, holding the handle down, and that case in position. The case should be in that station, in station number 3. Screw the die down until you feel that inside of the die body will be going inside the case. So when you get to that point, release pressure. When you no longer can turn it easily, release pressure and screw it down approximately half a turn farther and raise it up. Now remove that case and see if that will accept a bullet. It should be belled enough to just accept a bullet and no more. This particular case needs to be opened up just a hair more. Try it again. Do it in increments. So we're going to screw it down another half a turn. Let's see how that works. Perfect. You don't want to overexpand it, because if you overexpand it, it's going to catch on the next die and it's going to fold this back and chip the mouth of the case or collapse it. So you just want to expand it enough to accept the bullet freely. And also, if you overexpand it, then you're going to have problems with overworking your brass, and you're going to work hard on your brass. And you can't anneal pistol cases. It's just impossible to anneal pistol cases. So just expand it just enough so that you can easily slide a bullet down and get it started. In fact, I've got it probably just a little bit too much, so I'm going to back it off just a tiny bit of a turn. Now I'm going to tighten down that lock ring. There we go. That's station number 3 is almost set up. Now we need to put the powder hopper on top of it. Now I've opted to use this disc system, and if you're using the drum measure, then simply follow along with the directions that they give you in the owner's manual. But screw this, either one, screw them down onto the top of your die. With this particular measure, you want to make sure that the control arm, the actuator, is on the outside, and that's going to actually be positioned. I'll show you in a moment. I'll tighten that down fully. Now arrange a length of bead chain about 1 foot long. It should come with the disc system. Make sure that you place your bell adjuster about at least 1 inch above the bottom of the chain. That's acting as weight ballast, and that heavy spring that comes with it, just slide that down on top of the bell adjuster. Feed it up through, be sure that your ram is fully down. Pass the bead up through the hole provided for in the head of the ram. Feed it through the outside of that lever on the powder measure, and then back through on the inboard hole. And what you're seeking to do here is to provide this is just a link to return this lever. Take a case, feed it into the third station, and run it up. What you're looking for now, that case is what is actuating the powder measure. It's not the chain, it's the case that's actuating the powder measure. The chain is going to pull that back after it's completed. What you want to check for is make sure that that lever is going fully up. That should be doing that automatically if you have that case adjusted properly, the die adjusted properly down onto the case to bell it. Pull it back down. Now it should be pulled all the way. You don't want to have it so that the chain is too tight, because if this chain is tight, you're going to snap that chain. The leverage on this press is sufficient to snap the chain very easily. Now with an empty case, slide it into station number 4 and run your ram all the way to the top. With your bullet seating die, turn your lock ring all the way to the top threads so that you have plenty of room to do what you need to do, and turn this die down onto the case. What you're looking to do now is to run the die down all the way until you feel the case give resistance. That case now is approaching the area where it would be crimped by this die, which you don't want to do. This die is going to be bypassing the crimp stage. It's only going to be seating bullet. So turn it exactly a half a turn back from that crimp position and adjust your ring down. And again, as a reminder, make sure you hold the press handle down as you're doing these adjustments, because that thread will easily push that ram back down and give you a false adjustment. So I've got that tight, and the bullet seating stem should be backed off until it comes to a dead stop. That's important because we don't want to be doing anything with the bullet seating until we get to that adjustment stage. The factory crimp die cannot be adjusted until you've been running a case all the way around all the different stations. When you have a completed round, then you make this final adjustment. So we'll hold off on that one. Now, to set up your case feed mechanism, you're going to need the following. You need to have the crank right here. That's the part with the swing arm on it. That's your crank. You need a pencil. You need the crank stem, a 7/16 wrench, and that's a 11/16 wrench, a Phillips screwdriver, and you need your slide. Make sure that if you have the 2-part slide that you line up this surface and this surface should be flush, and also flush here. That's very important to make sure that you don't have any collision of parts. And if you haven't already done so, remember, I really prefer Lubriplate to do any lubrication on the outside of the press. The regular grease gun is fine for lubricating the axles on the linkage, but as far as lubricating the outside parts of the press, Lubriplate is far less messy. So we're just going to apply, let's bring it in closely so you can see, right on that square. I've already applied some, but just for illustration, just fill that square hole. That's all you're doing. You don't want a lot of lubrication. But the Lubriplate is basically it's a mixture of calcium. It's probably ground animal bones, and mineral oil, and it provides fabulous lubrication without being messy like axle grease is. Your slide will simply position just like that. But before we do that, take your crank stem and insert it into this hole down here. Now, what I recommend is that you first start out with this nut, this lock nut tightened. Start out with 4 threads and see how it works on your machine. I know that this can vary from one machine to the other, but see if you can have 4 threads exposed right here, and that may work for your machine and cut down on the number of times you have to go through the adjustment. Use your pencil to provide the correct measurement, the correct clearance between the tongue and your stem. As you do that, tighten this bolt right here. That locks that stem into place. Hold it tight as you secure it, and that doesn't require any severe torque on it whatsoever. So once you've got this stem mounted in place, now you want to put the crank on it. This is what I suggest now. Put the slide on the tongue first, and then open up the crank at the top. Is that right, Benny? Open up the crank at the top by removing this screw here. You notice there's a screw that's out on a protrusion. Take the top one off instead. Don't lose that screw, as I'm probably going to do if I don't pay attention. Now you can open up that side plate just like that. And before we put that on, just take a small amount of lubriplate. And once again, this is the best lubrication I know for this particular job. I know in my previous video I said do not lubricate this because it will make a mess. Well, that's still true, but this stuff here, it's got a totally different feel to it than regular grease. Just take your fingers and put that much on. That's all you need. That will provide enough lubrication so it doesn't start squeaking. That's all it does. Is this, after a while, this crank might start squeaking. With that hatch open, position this so you can line them up. Bring your ram up, slide that through the hole on the slide, and now you can close that window and return the screw. Now loosen up the bottom one about a half a turn and tighten the top one. All adjustments to tension are made with the bottom one, and the top one is always left snug. You don't want to tighten it down too tight. You don't want to strip those threads. Now check out the operation. On the upstroke, you'll notice that crank positions that slide inward, and there's friction involved between the crank and the crank stem. If you don't have friction there, it's not going to work correctly. So you want to adjust that screw so that it maintains sufficient friction to stay in place when it would normally fall. This is important because you don't want it to slide down by itself. You want it to always just grab itself and hold itself in place during these idle periods, and then slide up willingly. And that's the correct operation. That's working just about picture perfect. It's smooth. And one thing I want to stress here at this point, be absolutely sure that your press is not colliding with the slide. If it does, you're gonna ruin this. You're gonna ruin this slide. You want to have no contact with the slide and the press whatsoever. If there is any, then you back out this post, and basically you have to dismount the stem back out the post 1 turn or 2 turns, whatever is required to get full clearance, and then take a case, drop it in right here, and that should place it in position where it's about to be fed in. And on the upstroke, when I'm pulling the handle down, you'll notice that the slide is now pushing that case fully into the shell holder. And it should be backing off. Now I'll take another case, and when I reach the upper part of my stroke, I drop a case in right here, as the tubes would do, and I'm watching here. It should smoothly glide over and get out of the first case should get out of the way of the second case without collision. If they collide, you're going to have problems. If there's any collision, you back this post off with the hole in it, back that post off 1 more turn, because you don't want to have these 2 cases banging into each other, and they're going to hold up your shell plate, and it's going to misfeed. So that's a critical adjustment. There's only one place that it will work, and all other places it won't work. So you'll have to turn it in progressively, trying it and seeing which position works best. It's a little bit of trial and error, but that's the most important part of this press operation. Now, to set up your powder charge, you want to have a case which has been previously fired with the spent primer in it. That's very important. You don't want to be doing this with a brand new charged primer, because you're going to be trying this case over and over again, and you don't want the hazard of a live primer in there that might possibly have issues. So take a case just like that of the caliber, and whatever bullet you've selected. This happens to be one of my hand cast Lee round nose flat point bullets. It's a 200, nominally it's a 210 grain bullet. It actually weighs 208 grains according to the alloy that I have. This is a little bit harder than the standard alloy, so it makes it lighter. You know, alloys are lighter than lead. So this is a 208 grain bullet by average. I weighed out several of them to find that. Now, the standard rule of thumb, as you can see right here with the accurate powder data, and I've chosen accurate number 5. That's this powder right here, and it's a good powder. I've used this powder in 9mm and different calibers, pistol calibers. It's a very nice powder. It meters beautifully. It's a ball powder. I could have chosen bullseye or green dot or red dot or any number of powders that I have on hand, but this one here has good loading density, and I like to have a case that's filled up a little bit more than you would normally fill with such fast burning powders as bullseye or even accurate number 2. So the rule of thumb is to always use the stated bullet weight that you have if it's available, but of course a 208 grain bullet is not something that's listed under lead bullets for number 5. I'll bring it in just a little bit closer. You can see right here I have for number 5 for lead bullets, I have a 220 grain round nose flat point. I have a 240 grain round nose flat point. Well, 220 is the closest I can come to 208. And that's fine, because the standard rule of thumb is that you always can use loading data for a heavier bullet than the one that you're using, rather than going to the lighter bullet, because then you're working in unknown territory. But if you are using a bullet which is heavier than your bullet, I can use the 220 grain bullet as my guide. And I'll put a tick right there, because I want to be sure that I'm constantly looking at that particular charge and no other. I don't want to go to a different line. I just downloaded this from their website. This is for accurate powders. Now, the charge weights go from 7 grains to 7.8 grains, and with a 220 grain bullet, it achieves velocity of 844 feet per second. That right there is that's a fun load with this bullet. And 959 feet per second. That's a little bit hotter than I really want for a plinking load. I don't want to have a full steam load. I want to have a good fun plinking load. Well, I can always use this lighter charge, 7.0 grains at 844 feet per second. I'm probably with a bullet that weighs 7 grains, 8 grains lighter, I'm going to be achieving greater velocities than 844. I'm probably going to be up somewhere around 900 feet per second, so that's ideal. I don't want to drop down below that because I want to make sure I have good loading density so that I don't have any, so that I can look inside those cases and make sure that I have the right amount of powder. So the next step is to go to the Lee VMD chart. Now, Lee has a online site where you can look up the VMD. That's the volume density, metric density, and it happens to be 0.0623. I always write that whenever I buy new powder. I always consult that chart and carefully transfer that number onto the powder cam. Be very sure that you read that 2 or 3 times, because if you type that number in wrong, if you transpose that wrong, you could blow your gun up. So be sure that you calculate from that number. It's very easy to do. You multiply the 7 grains times 0.0623 and you'll come out with the actual loading density for that particular charge. We'll do that. 0.0623, and compare your numbers and be sure that you're writing the same number and not transposing digits. Times 7 grains, and that equals 0.43. So in other words, that's the volume of the metric volume of that particular charge. In other words, in cc's. So all I have to do is find which one of these discs, there's a whole set of discs, which comes closest to 0.436. That would be average of 0.44. So on another disc, the next smallest disc, I have 0.43, and that's the smallest that's listed. That's as close as I can get. Well, we can check that math. So we have 0.43 divided by that same number, 0.0623, 0.0623, and that should give me an actual charge of 6.9 grains. So that's what my charge should check out with. So I can write that number down on my page. 6.9. So when I check my charge after I weighed it, volume and weight do not necessarily come out the same all the time, because powder density can change from one lot of powder to another. But I want to be sure that I'm arriving at a number which is similar to that number there, 6.9 grains. I've got a double disc extender riser on this powder measure from doing 223 loads. So I remove the knurled nuts. And by the way, it's always use only your fingers to tighten knurled nuts. The manufacturer goes to great expense to put nice checkered knurls on these, and I see people taking pliers and reefing them. I don't know what in the world they think those nice knurlings are for. And this is the extension in order to use a double disc to stack one piggyback on top of another. If you happen to be using a double disc, always put the larger hole below the smaller hole, never in the other direction, because you don't want to have a shelf. Now we want to position 0.43. Double check your numbers. There's 0.43. That number right there goes on top of this actuator arm. And there's a closer look. And be sure if you're using numbers like 66 or 99 that you have the decimal on the correct side, otherwise you'll be reading the wrong number. So you can see underneath this disc are some slots. That 4-3 will go right on top of that actuator right here, and it should be sitting flush. Place the square side of your hopper and make sure that your hopper is turned in the on position. There's an on-off. Make sure your hopper is turned in the on position. Turn the hopper itself and position those screws down on top and secure your thumb nuts. Once you've done this a couple of times, you'll speed right through the process. It's very intuitive. And what I like about the disc system is it's foolproof. You don't have to worry about double charges. You don't have to worry about powder bridging or anything like that. These holes are a straight drop straight down into the case. Now it's always good practice to fill your powder reservoir at least halfway or more. That provides good density. Ball powders like this is a very fine ball powder. These will load with perfect density all the way to the bottom. That's one of the nice things about fine ball powders. Again, this is most important. Be sure that you have a primer in that pocket, a spent primer. Otherwise you're going to have powder flowing out the bottom of that hole as fast as it goes in. Place a case on station number 3 and just run it straight up, and you watch that disc slide right over, and it should be positioned directly over that hole. And remove the case carefully so that you don't spill your powder. And we're going to weigh that. That charge weighed exactly 6.9. Now you might be wondering why I didn't drop a couple of charges first. Well, with ball powder, very fine ball powder, they really don't stack any differently regardless of how much you have in them or whether they dropped firmly and solidly into that hopper. So as I would normally with flake powders or other type of powders, I would run a couple of charges first, but with ball powder that's not necessary. We'll put another one in there, and I like to run 3 and get a good average. That one came out to 6.8. I'll do one more. 6.8 is certainly within my margin. And again, that one was 6.8. So it was 1/10 of a grain heavier because of that first charge where I poured it down in. That's a beautiful load. That comes very close to the 7 grains, and that's going to give me probably, just extrapolating data, that's probably going to be giving me close to 900 feet per second, which is a speedy load for a 44 special. Before proceeding any farther, make sure that you keep your empty bottle of the correct powder that you're using on your bench near your press, and don't allow any other powder bottles to be on your bench, because that verifies what you've been using. So otherwise you're really lost and you could possibly blow a gun up. So now we're going to turn to the primer feeding system. Loosen up the shell plate nut. Be careful not to lose track of the O-ring that's underneath it. Usually it stays in place, so that O-ring has been in there for many, many years. I've been using this press, I guess now, for close to 15 years. Remove the ejector and make sure that you have all these indexers out of the way. Make sure the shell retention arms are out of the way and they're not inhibiting. Just lift the shell plate straight up. You might need to wiggle it a little bit. You'll need a priming pin of the correct diameter. This one happens to be for the large pistol or large rifle primer, and make sure you have a good straight spring. These springs can get very easily mangled, so make sure you have 1 or 2 on hand. Lee is terrific about shipping. If you order one, if you order two, they'll ship one for free. That's what they've been doing with me. What I'm going to do first of all is apply a drop of lubriplate. And there's only one spot that this should be put, is in this slot. You'll see there's a slot right here underneath this priming pin. Put just one drop of lubriplate underneath that, right like that. That's your priming arm will contact that and have good lubrication. Now, the spring goes on the outside. The spring goes on the back side, and that saddle fits down on top of the arm, which is right here. This arm lifts that pin straight up and down. Carefully, with all due care, and without bending that spring, take your priming feed mechanism. First of all, turn this case retention arm, this stainless steel case retention arm. Swing that inside, not outside. Swing it inside and drop the priming feed mechanism into that. Swing the shell plate, this portion of the shell plate here, swing it underneath the arm on the priming mechanism so that it doesn't get jammed. Then just drop it straight down in. Once that's in, just check it and make sure it's turning freely, and return your indexer. Remember, bring it up to the topmost position and just allow it to feed its way in. You need to coax that first time. Swing this plate back and forth until the indexer finds home. Don't try to just ram it home by force. Just all you have to do is, again, just turn this plate back and forth. If this plate, when the handle is all the way forward, if this plate doesn't have a tiny little bit of slack like that, and I'm not talking about a lot, I'm only moving back and forth less than a 32nd of an inch. If it doesn't have that much, then this indexing arm here can be taken out, and you can unwind this wing by one turn, and that will loosen it. If it's too tight, if it's too loose, if that plate is swinging back and forth more than just a very slight amount as you saw, then tighten it up by turn it in by one turn, and that way there you'll have that's your adjustment. This ejector is not the adjustment for that slack. That's a large misconception. There's an important part of this ejector, though, that is involved with the backlash of this plate, and that's this arm right here. If you have too much backlash and you can't get it adjusted with this wing, then you can take a pair of pliers, grabbing from here to the outside, and squeeze gently from these two dimensions. Squeeze gently in with pliers, and what you're going to do is you're going to bring this arm a little bit closer to the radius of the hole that it drops into, and that will remove some of that slack. Usually it's right dead on the button from the factory, and also that arm should be down into the hole, the indexing hole. That's your anti-reverse, so that the plate won't spin backwards. You can turn that nut down all the way fully, and if it's once the press is broken in, you can tighten that firmly with your fingers so that it won't back off. Sometimes with brand new presses, you have to back that off a little bit for a while until things get into place. I find that with the newly designed shell plates, they turn more freely than the ones that had the round nubs underneath. So that's turning perfectly. And never swing that hard home, because you're going to overturn that. You're going to spin that too far, and it's going to miss the next indexing spot, and you'll crush your cases. So just nice smooth operation. If you have to develop any speed, it's during the middle. But you're really, as long as you're maintaining that speed right there, you're doing hundreds of rounds per hour. Hundreds. Now on the left side of the press, take some lubriplate. That's all that you need right there, just that amount. And apply that underneath the quarter 20 bolt. And that will provide plenty of lubrication for that priming arm. Now I'm going to snug down all the case retention arms so that they're firm, not over tight. If they're over tight, you won't be able to swing them by hand when you need to. That one I can tell has perfect tension, and this one here probably can be loosened up a little bit. I wouldn't be able to turn that into place with the, that should do it. So now that those are all positioned inboard, especially the one by the priming system, swing that one inboard. It's a little bit tight. Just the screw, you'll get the feel of it. That screw needs to be firm but not over tight, because otherwise you won't be able to swing them into place. This is cool. We're getting close to full operation. Now you need the case feed mechanism. Remove the bottom nut, and you need a coin and 2 7/16 wrenches. Place the coin on top of this case slide. Drop this bolt down into place and screw the nut on. If that coin is in place, ride this ram all the way to the top where the lower part of this press would contact the case feed system. Make sure you have clearance there before you bring everything down. Just bring that nut down finger tight. Don't keep screwing it, because it's gonna wind it up. Now take your 2 7/16 wrenches and tighten her up. And again, make sure you have clearance there. You should be able to look through. If not, turn that away with your wrench so that you have at least a 1/16 of an inch clearance between this part of the press and that tubular feed. Because if you don't, you're going to be jamming that, and you're going to have problems, and you're not going to know what's going on. Now just run that up and down and make sure that you have clearance and there's no interference whatsoever. Make sure you recover your coin. Here we go. And check it once more. Everything seems to be running good. And remember, this crank here should stop without sliding back down on its own. It should hang up right there, and it should slide down smoothly. Now it should hang up right here without dropping. If it needs adjustment, just take a screwdriver and your Phillips screwdriver and tighten this just a quarter of a turn at a time until you have the right amount of tension. And without binding. They should want to slide up and down freely. I've got a little bit of grease right there. I can wipe that off. I don't need to have more grease than what's necessary. Everything should be operating nice and smoothly at this point. You can run that back and forth a few times and make sure that you have everything running smoothly. Now, there's a little secret to filling the case collator. You don't want to have cases go in upside down. So when you drop your cases, don't drop them onto the holes. Drop them off to the side as you shake, and they'll automatically orient themselves. And just lay them in place. I first used one of these case collators many years ago. 45 years ago, I was using one of these on a Star Universal reloading press at the police station, and I ordered that press for the department from, I'll never forget him. He was great. His last name was Pettis, Mr. Pettis from New York State. He was up near, I think, he was up near Lake Erie in the northern part of New York. At the time, nobody else had a Star Progressive press, and that was the press in the day. But nobody had one, and he did. In fact, he had a couple on hand. And he had that shipped off to us in no time with a Hilmi case feeder, which I think is probably what this Lee case feeder was loosely based on, H-U-L-M-E, Hilmi. And now with your primers in your tray, make sure that all your anvils are looking at you, and take that pencil once again and position it right here at this gate and prevent those primers from going in prematurely, and just slide it into place and give it a good shake. Fill that top up. Well, things are getting exciting. One more die to set up and then we're ready to begin. This is your factory crimp die. Run the adjusting nut all the way to the top and back your stem out fully until it comes to a stop finger tight. And just start it into the press, into the last station. That's sufficient. Before you begin, make a visual check, and you'll see that there's a stub, a small stub sticking up. It should be inside this oval tray, this oval track right here. That operates your primer mechanism, your primer feed mechanism, and travels the primer into battery. So make sure that that is up and over that stub before you begin. Check to be sure that your powder hopper is turned in the on position. Your case retainers should all be swung inward toward the shell holder on each station, especially over the priming station. Snug down your screws, but not over tight, because these have to be able to ride up over the rim to make their first adjustment. They'll adjust by themselves as you travel the case around to each station. Now, slowly we'll proceed, and at each station make sure you make a full travel of the arm all the way down. Now, you're going to be surprised by the sudden resistance. That's the case. If it's indexing correctly, that's the case feeding into the sizing die. So you're going to have some firm resistance there, but it should feel smooth with no binding. The next case is dropping down, and we're sliding to the next position, station number 2. Watch your primer feed. That should have just fed a primer into place. Now we'll stop at this position. Very first thing we want to do is check and make sure that we have a primer in that case, which we do. Check the seating depth and make sure that it's adequately deep. This one's a little bit proud. I can feel that primer, so I'm going to make an adjustment on that bolt. Now, I strongly recommend making a witness mark with a Sharpie on the press itself, and then also down on the shank of the bolt at the same location. Yes, we hear you, Benny. I know you want to go out. Then when you make adjustments, if you lose track, you can always go back. Use your wrenches, loosen up the lock nut at the top. Now, using that indexing mark as a guide, we want to lower this in order to tighten the primer more deeply. I'm going to go about 1/3 of a turn, should be sufficient, I think. So I made about 1/3 of a turn. That may be sufficient. I think that's going to be more than enough to drive that primer home deeper. So we'll try it on the next turn and see what it does. And we're just going to feed another case over to it from the priming station and stop it right there and remove it. Inspect your primer. Now we haven't charged powder in that yet, but I'm checking that primer, and it still feels a tight, just a small amount proud. I'll turn it in another third of a turn. Really small changes will affect more than a few thousandths of an inch. Let's try it again. Move that case retainer out of the way. And that one feels good. And it's not crushed. If it is crushed, if you notice any flattening of the primer, you've perhaps gone a little bit too far. Now, if you want, you can take this empty case and put it into a revolver and try it and make sure that you actually have ignition on it. You know, you use hearing protection. When you fire it, that primer will back out because there's no resistance of a bullet. But you can check it with your revolver and make sure that it is working. Run one more case around, double check it. And it feels good. It feels nice and snug into that primer pocket. Now, if you ever show up with any dents in your primer, that means that you have dirt, possibly a grain of powder on top of your priming ram. So just clean that off, wipe it off with your finger. But we're ready to begin. So the next thing I can do is put that case is ready to go. It's got a good solid primer. The others I'll hold in abeyance, and I'll simply reseat those primers on another trip around. Now swing your retainer out and light your case and make sure that you have powder in there. Now we're going to seat a bullet. Back off the seating stem all the way. Place a bullet into the case and raise it into position fully. Now we're going to turn the seating stem down until it contacts the bullet. Once I've contacted the bullet, relax the press, but be sure that you don't back this powder. Watch that powder disc. Do not back the powder disc out. Just lower it down sufficiently so that you can lower down your seating stem by one turn and seat it into place fully. Drop it down and see how much bullet you have seated into the case. And as you can see, I'm almost there. I've got about just a little bit more of the seating band to go. That's probably less than I'd say that's less than a half a turn. I'll give that about a third of a turn. And we'll try it on the next case. We can always seat those deeper afterwards. So these are just your test cases. Place your bullet into position. I turned that seating stem by a third of a turn, and we'll see how this goes. All the way down. And check your seating depth. It's almost perfect. I can go I know how much I turned it in the last time. I'm just going to go about 5 degrees, and that's going to be good to go. Now I can close my retainer back in. I'm ready to begin. So now I advance this to station number 5. Now we're going to be adjusting. Don't forget to put a bullet on station number 4. We're going to be adjusting your factory crimp die. Bring that 5th station all the way up. Spin your die down onto the case, holding that ram into position. Make sure your ram is fully extended in the upright position, and screw this die down finger tight onto the case. Tighten up your lock ring. The lock ring is down nice and tight now. Now it's time to adjust this stem right here. This controls your crimp. Again, you can put a mark on there with a Sharpie, index mark at the top. Holding the ram down, actually lifting the ram up just slightly, but do not allow that powder disc to turn. Just lower it down very slightly and turn this screw in. A half a turn will give it a light crimp, and a full turn will give it a heavy crimp. We'll give it a heavy crimp for any revolvers like this. That's it. We should have a completed round now, popping out onto the tray. Voila! It couldn't be better. I can drop that bullet down in just maybe a little bit so that I'm in that crimping groove a little bit tighter. Remember that this factory crimp die makes its own crimp. It doesn't rely on a groove. But I can spin this seating stem down just a little bit by about a 5 or 10 degrees, like from 12 to 1 o'clock, and that'll give me a little bit lower bullet position. Make small incremental changes, and we'll try it again. You can always seat it deeper. And that looks like it's going good. I guess we're ready to go out in a second, Benny. He's really getting impatient, so watch that one and see how it came out. Beautiful. That's exactly what we're looking for. Nice tight crimp. And by the way, that factory crimp die, you cannot really over crimp it. It's always going to crimp the way you want it, but a full turn will give you a nice tight crimp like that. I'm going to go down just a tiny bit more with the bullet seating die. That's all. Okay. We can move right along now, and don't let your tray go empty. Your case feeding system. So turn that into position. Otherwise, you're going to be having no cases go around. We can proceed now at full operating speed. This is working beautifully. Now you can get a bullet feeding system from Lee, and they're length specific, length and caliber specific. This is going good. So thanks for watching, and a special thanks to my Patreon donors for helping me purchase the materials necessary to bring you these videos. Thanks for watching. Benny and I will be out soon, and God bless.